Hello, and welcome back to the Fanfic Reread Project. This will be the last episode of our reread of Prophs 1.0, where we will read 3 Daenerys chapters from a version of this where Daenerys was actually in it. I don't know why this was a thing, but for a long time, Daenerys just wasn't in Prophs for various reasons. Sometimes she straight up just didn't exist, like she had died before the events of the story, and then other times she did exist, but she was just completely out of the viewpoints of the other characters. I'm not entirely sure why I kept cutting her out, but this time I decided to put her in. So let's get right into it. Not a cloud floated in the sky, letting the sun beat down on the red clay balcony beneath her feet. The city spread out beneath her, sweating in the immense heat. She didn't mind a bit, and she barely broke a sweat. The warm breeze blew at the threadbare dress she wore, waving the loose fabric around her feet. She wished she could stay there all day, bathing in the sunlight. Alas, that was not the case, not on that day. She turned back into the washing room, stepping over pearled and glass tiles. The slaves were warming the water for her bath, and the steam curled up into the air before it disappeared. The dress hung from the door, all sheer and pale and blue. It will bring out the color of your eyes, her brother Viserys had told her. He said she would have jewels as well, and a tiara. You'll look a princess today, he said. She should have been excited about that, but she wasn't. So let's pause here. Just a few things to note. As before, I am translating all the names back to the names that were originally in A Song of Ice and Fire. All of this stuff is in Elvish, though here, now we are getting into the Sindarin Elvish, because back in the day, for some reason, I decided that Kenya would be all of the languages in Westeros, and then Sindarin would be for everyone in the East, because that totally makes sense, and everyone speaks the same language on a continent. Also, I almost forgot to do this, but I do need to give warnings out for these chapters. I think the third chapter is generally all right, but the first 2 chapters both have some very sketchy content, especially the second one. So, sexual assault warnings on all of this, just so you know, so you can brace yourself. Let's keep going. It was generous of Magister Illyrio to give them all these things, but it made her uneasy. She'd seen many a man who had tried to bribe and swindle them as they moved house across the coast. She didn't expect any different from the Magister, but he didn't seem the same. Her brother said the Magister was just trying to win his favor, for when he took back the throne, he would remember those who had helped them. It still made her uneasy despite that, but her brother wanted to hear none of that. The throne, she thought. She'd never seen it, not even in pictures. Her brother spoke of the throne and all the lands that should have been theirs, the ones that were theirs by right. He told her of the great green fields of the Reach and the deserts of Dorne, of the cold wastes of the north and the storming seas of the Stormlands. He mentioned any number of castles that sat on sparkling rivers and hillsides of gold and mountains that looked like they were crafted from silver. The people of the east called it this sentence is not going to make much sense because these different languages don't exist, but the people of the East called it Anun, and the scattered Westerners she'd seen called it Nuna. They just sounded names to her. Both of those things are just names for Westeros. I don't think Westeros had a name in Bastard Valyrian or anything like that. Not that I can remember, so I couldn't replace that, sorry. She'd never known even an inch of the place. Her mother and brother were forced to Dragonstone before she was even born. Her other brother had already been dead by then, slain by the usurper, her father murdered by his own guard. Mother died the night she gave birth to her, and her brother said that her last word was Daenerys. They had been taken in a storming night and sailed for Essos. They lived in Braavos for some time, but then their savior, Sir Willem, died and they were locked out. They had been wandering the coast since, which is why she found it even stranger that Magister Illyrio had let them stay for so long. No one else ever did. She did long to see the throne in their lands one day, but she doubted she would. Her brother was marrying her off to some Dothraki horse lord, or so they hoped, in exchange for an army to help him win his throne. She didn't like the idea. Surely she was too young. She'd bled already, but her body was still padded in baby fat. Surely Khal Drogo would want a woman and not a girl. Surely she was not worth 40,000 men. Uncomfortable. Yeah, I don't really have much to say here. I don't know if I would say this is an exact copy of Dany's chapters because, again, it has been a while since I've read a Game of Thrones, so I don't remember the exact content. But as far as I know, the events follow both this and the equivalent scene from the show somewhat closely. I don't remember if all of this stuff is in there, though. But this is interesting so far. I will say it's doing a good job of introducing us to Dany's situation, you know? She had thought that she would marry her brother when she came of age. Their family had wed brother to sister for hundreds of years to keep the dynasty clean. The bloodline must be kept pure, she had been told many times before. Only fire must touch fire. No Targaryen had eyes for anyone but another Targaryen. Rarely did the blood leave the family, and those that were able to marry a dragon were honored beyond honor. Those eugenics, that like the keep the bloodline clean, that is just I don't like that. But that's there on purpose. So when she was young, their saviors would whisper to her that she was to be the queen of her brother Rhaegar. She liked the idea of that, being his queen. She thought she should dismiss it as the fanciful dreams of childhood, but as this day drew closer, she could not help but think of him, the prince she was promised. That Lyanna Stark was more an usurper. I don't know how to. I don't think that's supposed to be an Anne. That Lyanna Stark was more a usurper to her than Robert Baratheon ever was. So that's an interesting little detail there. And this is something that I think we can talk about a little bit more as we go on, but the idea of Rhaegar and her idealizing Rhaegar is sort of the same way that Robert idealizes Lyanna. It's very interesting. My lady, she heard someone say, your bath is ready. She was brought back to the washroom by the voice. She smiled at the girl, and the maids helped her into the bath. They washed her hair and scrubbed her until her... Okay, so this is a little bit weird. Dany's skin is described as yellow, which is a very, very strange and very, very, really kind of racially charged descriptor. I mean, throughout the years, the Targaryens have gone back and forth between being coded as vaguely Asian and then just kind of being, anywhere between, white and passing. I'm not entirely sure. I just know that that was not the word that I should have used there. Oh, past me. But anyway, so her skin went red. That's how hard they scrubbed her. Sexy. The water poured hot down her back, but it didn't burn her. It made her feel calm. When she was clean, they helped her out and dried her, brushing her hair until it shone silver white. The dress slid over her like water, so thin she could see her skin through it. They decorated her in bracelets, and a thin tiara was nestled into her hair, all delicate in silver and set with waterstone. She slipped her feet into sandals made of soft leather that had been silvered and shone in the sunlight. When she looked into the mirror, Daenerys the princess stared back at her. She'd never known this girl. The maids led her down the stairs into Magister Illyrio's massive hall. Viserys was already there, dressed in the black and gold of their house. A great gilded dragon decorated his coat, its 3 golden heads thrown back as if to roar. A sword with a golden hilt hung from his side. He took a visible breath as she descended the stairs to him. Turn, he said when she reached him. She did as she was told. The dress moved light as air. You look a dream, my princess, Magister Illyrio said as he stepped into the space. The man was draped in gold and red, and his gray and white hair had been oiled until it shined. Drogo won't be able to resist. Are you sure she's not too young? Her brother asked. She could feel his water-blue eyes on her body. Of course not, Illyrio said. If she ever looked a woman, it's tonight. Look at her. She is the vision of the Targaryens. Valyria reborn. He won't be able to resist, he repeated. She smiled politely, but inside she was shaking. He's a lucky man, Viserys said. That he is, Illyrio agreed. She felt her brother's hand tighten on the curve of her hip. So, yeah, we need to talk about this whole "is she too young" thing. Because on one hand, yeah, when Dany says it, it's her being like, shit, I'm 15 and I don't even know how old Khal Drogo is. I'm not old enough to be married. It's a manifestation of her fear about the entire thing. When Viserys says it, though, it's not that. As you will see when we read chapter 2. Oh boy. There's one thing I will say is that even though I'm not entirely sure I intended this when I first wrote it, these chapters do a really good job of conveying Dany's anxiety about this entire thing because I really feel for her when I read this stuff. Well, let's keep going. Illyrio led them to the rear of his home on a massive patio made of sandstone. Beautiful silk banners had been hung from the walls and waved in the breeze. The golden towers of Pentos languished in the afternoon sun. An attendant announced their entrance. So, very briefly, remember when Illyrio said that it was tonight? It's not nighttime. That was a weird little thing. I think that was something I probably copied from the book, where this did take place at night, and then I had it take place during the day like it does in the show. So, just a small mistake there, but anyway. An attendant announced their entrance. Viserys of House Targaryen, third of his name, king of the 7 kingdoms of Westeros. His sister, Daenerys, princess of Dragonstone. Everyone turned at the sound and paid their graces. People milled about of all shapes and sizes and colors. Colors. Men from the other coastal cities and tall, dark Dothraki. She soon realized that she was the only woman. The thought made her tighten. Illyria whispered names to her brother and pointed out people. Only one caught her. Sir Jorah Mormont, she asked. He's a knight? He is, Illyrio said, from your land. The king wanted his head after he sold some men to a slaver instead of sending them to the towers of the wall. He shook his head. A man should be able to do as he likes with his own chattel. I don't know if that's supposed to be chattel or chattel, but whatever. The knight was a handsome older man with salt brown hair streaked with gray, wearing a black coat of thin velvet trimmed in green. He looked out of place. It was so obvious he was from the west. So you can see here that the appearance of Sir Jorah is inspired by the show just based on the fact that he's handsome, whereas Jorah is not, he's not ugly, but he's not like cute in the books either. He's definitely just like an old hairy dude, you know? Where is he? Viserys asked impatiently. Illyrio rested a jeweled hand on his shoulder. Shortly, your grace. A shot from somewhere in the yard caught his attention. That would be him, just as I thought. Stay, your grace. I'll bring him to you. Illyrio held his silks as he went down the stone stairs. Daenerys felt herself go uneasy. Viserys, she whispered, I can't do this. You must, her brother told her. But I can't. I don't want to. I want to go home. His hands were hot against her bare shoulders. I want to go home too, he said. Do you think I don't? But how are we meant to go back if we cannot fight them? He leaned down so that his mouth was right by her ear. When I win back the throne, you will be my queen. She felt a shiver go down her spine. But now I need an army. You are the key to the crown. He straightened again. Do not disappoint me, sister. Now is when I need you most. There was a clamor of noise as the group approached them. Magister Illyrio glided toward them, followed by men on horses. She didn't have to be told which one was Khal Drogo. He was the tallest, even taller on his horse, with skin like copper and hair blacker than the night sky. His riding leathers were finer than any she'd ever seen. Another shiver ran down her spine at the sight of him. He was at least 20 years older than her. She drew in a breath as they came to a stop at the foot of the stairs. She wiped any trace of fear that might have been on her face and began down the stairs. There was a lot of repetition there. It's like she drew in a breath and then she drew in a breath. The Khal's deep brown eyes followed her the whole way down. When she stopped at the bottom, she put on a gracious smile. The Khal looked her up and down, then gripped the reins of his horse and rode off. Daenerys was absolutely bewildered, but Illyrio nodded approvingly. What happened? She heard her brother say as he came down the stairs. Does he approve? I'm sure, Illyrio answered. If he didn't, we would know. And that is the end of that. So, then I don't really have much to say. It is Daenerys' first chapter, as far as I can tell. I do think that this chapter actually does a pretty interesting job of melding together different aspects from the show and the book to make a new experience, particularly during the party thing. Because having the party from the book melded into that sort of ceremony scene at Illyrio's house outside from the show, it's just interesting, the way that I chose to sort of freshen the perspective, I guess, a little bit. Outside of this, I would say that this chapter is definitely decent. It does a good job of introducing Daenerys as a character, the situation that she's in. Same thing with, Viserys and Illyrio and this entire arrangement with Drogo. It's good. So let's move on to chapter 2. Again, please heed the warnings for this one, even though, the moment is brief and it's not graphic at all, but it is there. So let's get into it. Daenerys had never seen a celebration so huge or so splendid as her wedding to Khal Drogo, a raucous affair held in the spacious courtyard of the Khal's manse that the... Okay, so I'm a little confused here. So it says the Tolg there? I'm not sure how that is supposed to be, but from what I remember, that word is related to lore, so I'm not entirely sure that makes sense. The Red Priests aren't really in charge of paying the Dothraki, but let's try that again. A raucous affair held in the spacious courtyard of the Khal's manse that the magisters had gifted him to pay their graces. It seemed there were thousands upon thousands of people there, and it was not even half of the Khalasar. The previous night she had spent her last night in Magister Illyrio's estate. Illyrio gave them pounds of sumptuous food and drink, and he presented Daenerys with her wedding silks, thin wisping blue things, the color of her eyes. The night Sir Jorah Mormont came and offered his sword and counsel to her brother, and he accepted eagerly. After their dinner, she returned to her room, filled with fear for the coming day, but her brother called for her. A servant led her to the third floor where his room was. A shiver went down her spine when she saw that there were candles lit. I hate this part. Come here, her brother said from his bed. She did as she was told. He was dressed in a robe made of fine black silk. She could not see what was under, thank God. Sweet sister, he said, taking her face in his hands. Sweet, sweet sister. His hands moved from her face to her neck to her shoulders, and his thumbs moved the fabric of her dress. You've grown so much, nearly a woman. Don't remind me that she's still a teenager. Jesus Christ, Viserys. Okay, the call, she started. Not yet, he told her, not yet. He pulled her onto his lap. His hands were burning hot as he slid her dress down her arms. I'll teach you to win an army myself. Her breaths went heavy as he pulled at her small clothes. Let me teach you, sweet sister. Let fire meet fire. But she did not feel the fire like he did. She wanted so badly to be like him, like all the Targaryens before. Like Rhaegar, her prince, she was promised, set aflame for the blood of her blood, but she couldn't. She didn't feel the fire, but she could not say no. She was still sore the next day. All right. Okay, so that happened. I find this very interesting because in the book it is deliberately mentioned by Illyrio in this similar flashback. Or no, I think later that he mentions that he had guards put outside of Daenerys' room so Viserys couldn't do shit like that. But here, it happens. I think I had a reason for why I had it happen later. I don't remember exactly what it was, but I vaguely remember a version of prophs with there being some baby daddy drama with Dany, which is kind of like eye-roll inducing, but that's what it was. This might be related to that, I'm not entirely sure. However, I think what we really need to talk about with this is the whole thing with this let fire meet fire. This is a little something called the gift, which is an element of prophs that actually still exists to this day. It is basically that the Targaryens, way back when they first came to Westeros, after the War of Conquest though, Aegon Targaryen did not have any marriage prospects, but he wanted to marry someone who was Valyrian, but all of the Valyrian families that came north with them didn't have anyone who could procreate with him. So he is like, well shit, looks like I gotta go over to Essos, even though people are like, why don't you just marry someone from Westeros? And he's like, no. So before he goes, he gets like nervous because deep down he knows that what he's doing is fucking stupid. So he goes to Rosby, which is a town that is like north of King's Landing along the road up north to Maidenpool. And he finds this common woman who is believed to be like a woods witch or whatever. And he's like, lady, help me. I need to find a wife and I don't want to die. Because this is another important aspect, is the fact that in Profs, the Doom happened a lot closer to the War of Conquest than it did in that other story. What is that? In the source material, excuse me. In A Song of Ice and Fire. So it happens, like the Doom pops off like literally right after Aegon is born. So the Century of Blood is still on and popping when the War of Conquest is over. So he's like, shit, I don't want to get killed because everybody in the West is like killing Valyrians. I'm not going to get into the reason why that is happening, but suffice to say that the setup of the Valyrian Empire is a little bit different. So he goes to this lady and he's like, can you help me with some of your magics? And she's like, yes, I can. And then she puts a spell on him that is like something blood of your blood and blood of the dragon. And it's like, you will only be attracted to blood of the dragon. So that happens, and then Aegon is compelled to get back to King's Landing for some reason. And he goes back to the Red Keep as it's being built, and he sees one of his sisters, and he's like, and she's like, and then basically that's how the Targaryen incest started, instead of it being a cultural thing from Valyria. Like I said, this is a long-standing change that has been in pretty much every single version of Profs, except maybe the earliest versions before we got to the Elvish names. So that's basically what Daenerys is talking about there. The reason why Daenerys doesn't feel it is because the curse worked in such a way where every person of Targaryen blood that descended from Aegon and Visenya and Rhaenys was going to get it. However, as the Targaryens started marrying out of the family, because there's just so many of them that they can't all marry each other, the gift starts to act weird. So you get people like Daenerys here, who is skipped by the gift. And then you also have people like Baelor the Blessed in these stories where he felt the gift for multiple people, which would have become important for another character, but we're really never going to get to touch on that here. Maybe briefly in the Prophs 2.0 reread, but that's not for a little while now. So yeah, that's basically what Dany's talking about here. And the fact that she doesn't feel the fire, quote unquote, or suffer from the effects of the gift while Viserys does is kind of a big part of their relationship in all of the versions of Profs. So yeah, let's keep going. Her brother and Magister Illyrio and Sir Jorah Mormont sat below them, a place of high honor for guests. She could see Viserys looking at her every now and then, and she always averted her own eyes. She still felt like she betrayed the call, but he would never know. He had not broken her Oh, God! Why do I need to know that? And her brother had told her she would be better for it. Fire must touch fire, he had whispered to her. Fire will touch fire. She shifted in the seat next to the call. He was only called a call by the people in the cities. I think what it is that the words are like hir and ad or something like that. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing those right, but I think the accents indicate how long the vowel is supposed to be. I think the difference is that hir is like the Eastern version of the word Lord, while ad is the actual word call, so that was my fault for kind of fucking that up. However, Magister Illyrio is a magister, and he's also called here in this, so I'm not entirely sure. She shifted in her seat next to the call. He was only called a lord by the people in the cities as she watched the writhing Khalasar below her. They danced and they fought and they danced and they ate. There were plates upon plates of horse meat and goat's meat and duck and fish. Drogo's slaves brought the plates right to them and let them have their pick first. Her stomach roiled inside her and she couldn't take any. She only took the wine and then cider when she felt herself clouding. The call took everything he was presented with, unsurprising given his size. He ate and drank and barked things at his men in the old language. She didn't understand a word of it, and she wished she did. He didn't speak a lick of the Western tongue, so there was nothing to be said between them. She only knew what her name meant, sea-haired. I keep getting caught up on these Elvish words, I'm sorry. The Khalasar were nothing like the people in the cities. They wore thin leathers and cottons painted in all colors over bare chests, and the women wore thin wraps and sandals that laced up to their knees. They painted and tattooed their skin with blue and black in swirls and slashes. It was alien and strange and terrifying all the same. It was beautiful in its way as well. The woman danced in a frantic way and twisted and writhed and threw their hands in the air and closed their heavy blackened lids. Drogo's eyes followed their every move. His blood riders and the warriors shouted things at them and threw them medallions, and some of the warriors would mount them and gut any man who would try to take their woman. Sir Jorah told her that they did not know shame like they did. Shame was to lose a battle, and that was all. Illyrio told her that 3 men should die before she received her bride gifts. 6 were gone before noon broke. As the afternoon turned to evening, the call commanded silence. He got to his feet and then pulled her to hers as well. It was time for her gifts, and then after gifts she would take her first ride, and then she would lie with the call. She shook at the thought. Her brother bought her handmaidens, 2 Dothraki girls, one with smooth dark hair and one with tight brown curls. Jikwi will teach you the old tongue, her brother told her, and Iri will teach you to ride. She thanked him, and the girls bowed at her feet. My apologies, princess, Sir Jorah said as he came forward. My gift is small, but it's all a poor exile could afford. He brought forward a case filled with books of stories and songs of the 7 kingdoms, all written in the Western tongue. She thanked him graciously. Magister Illyrio came next, with large men carrying a large case made in rich pine wood. They opened it for her, and she saw layers upon layers of silk and soft cottons. Nestled on top were 3 large eggs. Their shells looked to be covered in scales. All 3 were black as the night, but one had specks red as fire, one had spots in a rich dark green, and the last was dotted with white that made it look like the night sky. She lifted one, and it weighed solid in her hands, like it was made of stone. Dragon's eggs, my princess, the magister told her, turned to stone by the years, but beautiful as the day they were laid. Thank you, Magister, she told him. They're the most beautiful things I've ever seen. The Call's blood riders brought her the traditional offering of the weapons, a brilliant whip made of lush brown leather, a scythe that looked as if it had been wrought from silver, and a bow made from dragon's bone, chased in fine black wood and heady gold. These are splendid, she began, just as she'd been taught, but I cannot bear the gifts of a warrior. Let my husband bear these in my stead. Her Call accepted his gifts, but then said something in the old tongue. Sir Jorah translated for her. He says that the bone of the dragon should be borne by a dragon, and so the bow came back to her. A shudder ran through her heart. Okay, let me pause right here, just to say that I do not remember exactly why that happened. I guess Dany was going to learn how to shoot a bow. I don't know. Every once in a while there will be a weird addition to one of these things of a detail from a plot that I don't remember, and I'm just like, eh? This is one of those things. She was showered with other gifts, piles of gowns and dresses and silks, fine sandals and boots of supple leather and riding leathers of her own. They brought her bracelets and rings and circlets and jewels, furs and painted cottons and colors for her skin. So many came and it felt like too much. It was more than she could ever ask for. Finally, her Call would give his gift. He led her down the stairs and through the massive crowd. All of the Dothraki followed behind him. He led her through the courtyard and into the front hall and then out to the front of the manse. The sunset sky was orange right above them. The most magnificent animal she had ever seen stood before her. It was the first time she had ever seen a labor. It had the shape of a horse, but it bore a smooth, thick skin instead of hair and had no mane. Two pairs of large canine teeth curved over the skin of its muzzle, and it bore claws instead of hooves. Her own had skin white as milk and claws in light gray. Its purple eyes locked with hers as she approached it. "It's beautiful," she told them. "She's the pride of the Khalasar, my princess," Master Sir Illyrio told her. "The Khaleesi should ride a mount worthy of her place beside her call." Drogo lifted her by her waist and sat her on the saddle as if she were made of air. She shifted in the leather and could not wait for Eerie to teach her how to ride. Suddenly she was lost. "Oh, what do I do now?" she asked. "Ride, my Khaleesi," Ser Jorah told her. "You must ride." And so she did. And it ends there. Thank God, because I don't think I'd be able to take the whole scene with Drogo after what happened with Viserys, especially because since this is based so heavily on the show at points, I have no idea how it would have gone. But so this chapter, if we're talking pure like quality of the writing, it's fine. I did trip over a lot of words, but that's because there was a lot of Elvish in this and I was trying to translate everything and my brain kept getting like fucked up. So that's why that happened. But otherwise, like the writing is fine. The contents of this chapter, though, I think are a bit questionable. If you removed certain parts, like the whole thing with the Viserys from the night previous and Dany getting the bow and those little moments, for the most part, this is just the wedding chapter from the book. And this is a lot closer to the book than it is to the show. But that stuff, like I said, I don't remember why Dany got the bow. I don't remember the significance of that. I'm sure it would have led somewhere eventually. But more so, I think the bigger issue with this chapter is the whole Viserys thing. Now, what I can say is that given Viserys' character and the context of the gift, what happens does make sense. I just don't know what it added to the story for Dany, and that's why I question why it was here. But yeah, I guess this chapter was fine. It was written fine. It is the same quality as the chapter we read before. But let's move on. So this is Dany's third chapter. As she climbed that hill, she felt like she was climbing the top of the world. When she broke the crest, all that spread out below her was a sea of grass, tall blades covered with buds that waved in the wind as far as the eye could see. But maybe that was the world, she thought. It was the world for the Khalasar. "It's lovely," she heard herself say. "You should see it when it blooms," Ser Jorah told her. "It all turns red everywhere you look, and that's just the glay. I don't know what glay are. There are grasses as green as the fields in Westeros and blue as the night, and the thar that grows beyond the mountains is as gray as a ghost. Oh, that's ghost grass. They say that one day it might pass the mountains and eat the sea." Daenerys shook her head. "Not now, sir. I don't want to think of that right now." She stood there and took in the silence. They'd ridden well ahead of the Khalasar, who were just starting to climb the hill behind them. She could see her call at the front, with his blood riders and her blood riders and handmaidens behind him. She could see her brother struggling along further back. Something had turned sour in her brother when he hit the horse's back. Illyrio had given him the hospitality of his manse until the Dothraki returned from Vaes Dothrak, but he declined and insisted on seeing them there. "I must know that I will have my army," he had said. He couldn't even ride the labor, however, and he didn't take well to the Khalasar's saddles. As time went on, he became curt and ill-tempered. She didn't want to face him at the moment. "Tell them to wait here," she told him. "I tell them I command it." He smiled. "You're learning to talk like a queen." "Not a queen," she said as she turned toward the fields. "A Khaleesi." Her labor turned and dug into the ground as she trod down the hill. She was not even afraid as they moved down the incline. She imagined that if she had done this before, she would have been terrified and would have probably fallen. The glade swallowed her whole when she hit flat ground again. When she thought back to the days before, she almost thought herself weak, but it had been fear that made her the way she'd been. Well, fear and inexperience. She'd been pulled from her labor, bloody and bruised for days after the wedding. Her handmaidens had to wrap her hands so that she might be able to hold the reins another day. The fear had come when she was faced with her call. He had been, oh boy, he had been gentle with her the first time he had laid with her, but even then it had brought a shudder to her. She had taken her meals alone or with her handmaidens and sometimes with her brother, though that was only when he called her. The Khal ate with his men and came to her in the night to take her, just as gentle as he'd been before, but she still cried from the sores on her thighs and bottom. I guess that's a difference in Drogo's character because I'm pretty sure that's not a thing that happens in the book or the show. The mention of the first night, that's from the books, but the other stuff. She didn't know how much longer she could take it then, but one night she slept and had a fearsome dream, one of dragon fire and rivers of blood. The flames of the creature washed over her like the waves of the sea, but she did not burn. It had felt so real, the way her blood boiled inside her veins, and when she woke she felt a different girl. She felt a woman. After that it all became easier. Her wounds healed and her skin toughened for it. She switched her silks for the tight woven and darkened leathers and sandal. When her husband came to her in the night, she greeted him, and when they laid, she cried, but not with tears. Ooh! Her brother seemed to become worse after that, but when he called for her, she excused him and dined with her call. Ooh, Dany! She rode into the grass and took in the plain, letting her hand run across the stalks as she passed them. She felt the buds and saw their ruddy petals bundled tightly together. It was so nice to be alone. No one was ever alone in the Khalasar. She rode ahead of them, but Ser Jorah was always with her, and in the nights she had her call and her handmaidens, and her blood riders were never too far. But now she was alone in the sea, surrounded by the hot air and the smell of soil and grass mingling with the scented oils on her skin. She suddenly hopped from her labor and unlaced the leather of her sandals. She waded into the grass on her 2 feet, curling her toes in the dirt. It felt warm and dry, but also a bit wet, and it felt right to be there, and she couldn't feel more like she belonged on the labor. She could feel her behind her, the breath hot in her arm. The Dothraki did not name animals, so she thought of her as the Fae, and if she ever said it, she only whispered it to the labor itself. Daenerys was brought back by the feeling of a hand gripping painfully on her arm. "You would give orders to your king," her brother said to her, anger coursing through his words like a river. She'd never heard him sound that way. "Look at you," he spat, shaking his head. She knew what she looked like. She looked like a Dothraki. "I promised you a kingdom, girl, and this is how you repay me?" Suddenly she wondered if he was still speaking of her command. She ripped her hand from his grasp and backed from him. "Maybe you should look at yourself instead." His eyes went wide at the sound of her words, and she thought hers should have too. He started to say something else, but there was a whip at his neck before the words came out of his mouth. Her brother went to the ground, grappling at the leather that was choking him. It was Ricardo, the young one, who had him, and behind him the others of her blood riders. He asked her a question, which she didn't understand there, but then Jiqui was there. I'm starting to think that Jiqui actually, the one that I said was Jiqui, actually was Eerie, because this is who it was in the show, but I'm not entirely sure. "He asks if you would have him dead, my Khaleesi," she repeated. "No," she said. The blood rider could understand that. "I do not want him harmed," she told her. Jiqui repeated, and then the whip was gone from him. Her brother glared at her from the ground, his neck looking raw and red. He did not look much a king down there, not even much a prince, not a bit like her prince she was promised. He looked a pity in his soiled silks and sweating wools. "I told him your orders, my lady," Ser Jorah said as he passed into the grass. "I know," she said. Suddenly words came from her that she didn't know she had. "Take the horse," she told him, "and let him walk." The man who walked among the Dothraki was not a man, no more than the dirt beneath his feet. Let them see him as he is. Ser Jorah looked from her to her brother, but then he nodded. "As you wish." He left to take his horse in hand. Her brother stared at her, absolutely silent and absolutely agape, but not moving from the ground as she mounted her Fae and rode back to the Khalasar. "Will he find his way back?" she asked Ser Jorah when he returned. "Of course he will," he said. "Even a blind man could find our trail." She nodded. "Do you think he would take us home?" she asked. "You're already here," Ser Jorah said. But she had meant the kingdom, King's Landing and Dragonstone and all the lands that belonged to the king. "My brother would never be king." "You think not?" "No, not even if Drogo gave him 1,000,000 men." And she meant every word. She couldn't help but think of her prince she was promised. "Rhaegar would take us home," she said sadly. The knight looked down. "If only he was here, child. If only he was here." "I am no child," she suddenly said defiantly. She pressed her heels to her Fae and she went forward, past him, deep into the great grass sea. And that is the end of Dany's chapters, so the chapter was fine. It was the chapter from the book. The thing that I mostly have to say about Dany's chapters is that they aren't super remarkable. They work for what they are because for the most part they are just retellings of the events of the book put in slightly different words with different names. It's not really as interesting as some of the stuff that we read, like the stuff we read last episode, where we were seeing different perspectives and different ways of looking at all these things, and some of which we actually did see. Which is another issue that I kind of had with Dany's chapters over time, is that Dany was the one character whose story was basically the same as it was in the books, whereas at the very least with most of the other characters I switched some things around. The only real difference was the addition of the whole thing with the gift, which, as you can see, takes up a bit of real estate, but not enough to make it really feel different. So yeah, like I said, this stuff was all right. It wasn't like the most remarkable thing, and it didn't keep me as engaged as some of the earlier stuff that we read, mostly because it was just the same as the book. And I think there is a way that you can write scenes that are the same as the book, but make them still feel interesting. I've done it before, and those chapters don't like bore me, but I don't think this did a very good job of it. But for what it is, it's fine. So I'm actually going to end it here. I know this is a bit short, but that is all of the content from Prophs 1.0. I think, generally speaking, I am surprised at the quality of this stuff, because I think what it is that I underestimate how good of a writer I was back in the day. And part of it is due to the fact that when I think of my early writing, I tend to think of things that I wrote after this. And a lot of the stuff that I wrote after this has a lot of really specific quirks that I find super duper annoying. So I tend to judge all of my old stuff as being like that, forgetting that there was a time before that stuff existed, and that stuff looks pretty different. I did start to see some of those quirks pop up here, just with that line where Dany was like, he was absolutely silent and absolutely agape. The overuse of the word absolutely is something that comes up a lot, as we'll see in The Dark Knight Rises, which is the reread after the next two. It's coming up pretty soon because the reread between it and Batman Begins is short, but we'll talk about that when we talk about that. Anyway, my point being that I found this stuff surprising because I was not expecting it to be written the way it is. However, looking at it, it is very reminiscent of a lot of what I wrote in The Hunger Games, though I think this is better than that. And I think part of that is just because The Hunger Games was a straight up sort of like plagiarism job. So a lot of the stuff that I didn't write that wasn't original was very, very boring because it basically took Suzanne Collins's words and then did it worse. Whereas when I started to go off book, that's when that story got interesting. Here, you do see a similar thing. However, I do think I handled the parts where I was transliterating the book better. It still wasn't interesting, but I definitely think it was better translated, but you could still tell it was like plagiarizing the book. So, but overall, the quality of this is surprisingly good for something that was written over the course of early 2013 and late 2012. So the next reread, we are going to dive into Batman Begins. This is going to be a longer one. Batman Begins isn't super duper long, but it is like 30 something chapters. So we'll be there quite a bit longer than we were on this. So if you like this, don't forget to like and favorite and subscribe. I always say that, and I still don't know if favoriting is still a thing. Anyway, I will see you for the next episode. So bye.